Russia begins talks of ending the war to save the economy. The Russian economy is increasingly feeling the consequences of the war against Ukraine, and representatives of big business and financial circles are already opening talks about the need to end hostilities to restore economic growth. This is reported by Reuters on the eve of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, according to UNN. Yeah, my understanding is that inflation has been significant since the onset of the war, that they've lost millions of, over a million or potentially millions of young, adult, working age men who would otherwise be contributing to the economy. And they've experienced significant economic isolation. I know a lot of European countries and a lot of countries just around the world have established blockades and trade embargoes and things like that against the Russian economy. And so, yeah, it doesn't surprise me one bit that they've experienced this significant economic turmoil in response to the years and years of this war. And remember, they expected this war to only last like a week. They expected to roll over Kiev very, very quickly. And so they sort of laid the groundwork for this war as if it was going to be a very quick, hot one, and like an unsustainable and established it as an unsustainable effort in the long run. According to the agency, Russian President Vladimir Putin will hold his fifth wartime economic forum in St. Petersburg against the backdrop of a deteriorating economic situation and the lack of a clear strategy for the country's further development. The Russian economy, whose volume is estimated at approximately $3 trillion, slowed its growth to about 1% in 2025, after 4.9% a year earlier. In the first quarter of 2026, the Russian economy already contracted by 0.2%. The Russian government attributes the problems to high interest rates, Western sanctions, and the strengthening of the ruble. At the same time, Reuters notes that Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian territory also have a significant impact. In particular, attacks on oil refineries, ports, and industrial enterprises have disabled a significant part of the economic infrastructure. According to the agency's estimates, approximately a quarter of Russian oil refining capacity has been affected, creating risks for fuel shortages. Oil is such a huge part of the Russian economy. I mean, they have massive oil reserves. They're a humongous country. And they famously ship a lot of oil to Asian countries like North Korea, to China, and also to various parts of Europe like Germany and whatnot. And so, yeah, if over the last year or so, Ukraine has developed enough military strength and has stabilized the front lines enough that they're able to start launching drone attacks on Russian industrial outputs and capabilities inside of Russia proper. And for a long time, they both weren't able to do that and didn't quite have like the authorization to do that. For a confluence of reasons, they've been able to do that recently, and it seems like it's been having a significant impact on Russia, alongside obviously the direct impacts of the war on Russia, like the losing of manpower in the economy, the loss of international trade because of sanctions and all that kind of stuff. Business believes that the best way to restore economic growth is to end the war in Ukraine. Reuters quotes one of the Russian top managers. The agency's interlocutor noted that the Russian stock market's reaction to any positive news regarding peace negotiations demonstrates the real expectations of business. At the same time, the negotiation process has effectively stalled. The Kremlin states that peace talks are currently on pause as U.S. attention has shifted to the Middle East. Reuters also writes that potential American investments in the Russian economy and a possible partial easing of sanctions, which were discussed earlier, are also currently frozen. I wonder why this article thinks that the war might potentially be ended and that Russia is seeking to reach some sort of ceasefire because of economic conditions, despite the fact that the Kremlin has stated peace talks are currently on pause, and that like allowing of American investment and the easing of sanctions or whatever are currently frozen. This seems to be sort of contradictory. Former deputy chairman of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, Oleg Vyugin, told the agency that the Russian authorities effectively have no effective mechanisms to restore economic growth. The government essentially has nothing to offer to restore growth, he said. Yeah, I would imagine that if like problems caused economically by the war lasting as long as it has are only going to continue to like grow and exacerbate, right? They're only going to continue to lose more and more manpower. They're only going to continue to experience the negative effects of these sanctions, right? And they're only going to continue to experience more and more drone attacks from Ukraine on industrial facilities and economic facilities or whatever, economic output like oil refineries and all that kind of stuff inside Russia proper. And yeah, it doesn't surprise me, like, with the whole world being mad at you, besides like China and a handful of close, powerful allies, right? They really have no path forward to, restore this economic output through trade, through allyships and relationships and stuff like that, because like if they're at war with Ukraine, they can't develop an allyship with or a trade partnership with Germany or Finland or something like that, right? That's just not going to happen. So because they're all part of the EU, they're all allied with each other, and like they see Ukraine as an important buffer state between the rest of EU proper and NATO and Russia. And so they are there. I don't really see any way that they become misaligned with Russia, with the Ukraine, and somehow align themselves with Russia. And furthermore, all of these European nations have, consistently and steadily been increasing their military support, their both economic, through cash injections and through, donating various types of military equipment like tanks and planes and bombs and missiles and drones and all that kind of stuff over the years. And so at this point, the Ukrainian military capacity might be even greater than Russia. My understanding is that Russia was drawing on a lot of military reserves of tanks and planes and drones and all that kind of stuff, and that like a lot of those reserves are really starting to run dry. And also, Russia has been going more and more into debt. A lot of their soldiers, both domestic and abroad, and they've increasingly been getting more and more foreign mercenaries. They have to sign expensive contracts with these people. And so my understanding is that Russia too has been going more and more into debt to facilitate all of this. The article emphasizes that most of the factors that ensured Russia's economic growth during Putin's rule no longer work or have exhausted their potential. This refers to foreign investment, cheap loans, high energy revenues, and import substitution. At the same time, even representatives of the Russian political establishment have begun to publicly acknowledge the threat to the economy due to the prolonged war. State Duma Deputy Renat Suleimanev told Reuters that the economy will not withstand a long continuation of the so-called special military operation. Yes, that's what they tell their population internally, like civilians and whatnot. That's what it is, right? So they can claim it's not a full-on war. It helps support their like facetious argument that like what they're doing in Ukraine is really like a denazification effort and all that kind of stuff, right? That's how they try and spin it internally, so that support for the war does not drop domestically, so that people don't start asking too many questions like, well, why are we invading it? We are the invaders, right? We're the bad guys. No, but if they're sold a lie that like, Ukraine is like really this Nazi country and that the special military operation is just to denazify them and reestablish their Russian roots, then they're much more likely to support it and whatnot. What kind of development, investment, or capital expenditures can we talk about? Tanks and shells have no consumer value, he said. And yes, and also the longer this goes on, and the more that the Russian economy is like sort of like transitioned into a wartime economy, it makes it all that much more painful whenever this war does eventually end. Whenever a ceasefire or a victory is held by either side, that like it's going to take them all that time to transition away from being a wartime economy, right? This is exactly what happened in Germany in World War I, right? I mean, Germany in World War I was suffering economic hardship for a lot of different reasons, but one of the main reasons was that during the war, during the 3, 4, 5, 6 years of the war, their economy had transitioned fully into a like war machine. And so as soon as the Treaty of Versailles was signed and the war was ended, and all 1 million or 2 million troops were suddenly injected back into civilian life, back into the economy, they had nothing to do with these people, right? There was mass unemployment, there was mass inflation, because like if an economy is reliant and built upon war, and then you deprive it of that war all of a sudden, then it's gonna experience hardship, at least in the short term, while it transitions back into a more diverse, normal type of economy. Analysts also note that Russia does not have sufficient internal resources for sustainable economic growth without an external impulse, in particular the easing of sanctions and the end of the war. Yeah, I don't really see any way that like the conditions get any better without the ending of the war or the ending of the sanctions, especially from and trade embargoes from other countries around the world, and especially European countries, which obviously will not happen unless the war is stopped. The only way that I could possibly see maybe this being skirted around is like through significant direct intervention from China. But China would probably only want to do that if they're able to make significant power type gains inside Russia proper, which I would think Putin and the Kremlin and current power brokers inside Russia would be against, right? They want to maintain as much of Russia's power internally as they can. I don't necessarily know if China would be interested in like land from Russia, but probably more so like a greater amount of political influence inside Russia, maybe a greater stake in their economy, a greater stake in the value of the ruble and things like that. That's really China has to be their lifeline in this. China has to be the only way that they could possibly overcome the hurdles that are clearly in their near future regarding a continuing degrading of the economic conditions and a continued negative post-war future that faces them. So yeah, this is sort of a contradictory article saying that the talks to begin the end of the war are, Russia begins talks of ending the war to save the economy, but then also like it says like, removing Western sanctions is off the table, and these talks are currently on pause because the U.S. isn't involved as much as they would like. A ceasefire at this point would be somewhat of a loss for Russia, right? They've invested a tremendous amount of resources. They've done tremendous damage to their economy, and they've lost over 1 million of their people. If they suddenly, were just like, yeah, okay, we're done. We're done with this operation. Give us a tiny amount of land concession from the eastern part of Ukraine, and that'll be good enough for us, right? I think that would look really bad internally, right? It might even spell the end for the Putin regime in some way, shape, or form, either through a coup or through just a complete collapse of political support from the citizenry. So yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure Russia has been signaling for a long time that they're in this for the long haul, and the way that Putin's been acting internally, he's very afraid of coups. He's been isolating himself more and more. I just have a feeling that like they're really. I don't see this happening anytime soon. I don't really see any reason why this wouldn't have happened 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? I mean, the people, the high level analysts, both economic and militarily and strategically and whatnot in these governments, in the Ukrainian government, the Russian government, the Russian military and all that, they understand the potential effects of all this, right? They have actuarial tables. They have the ability to project in the future, what happens if we continue to do this? What happens if the war continues? What happens if Ukraine starts to attack our industrial facilities? Yada, yada. They have the ability to track all these things way in the future, right? They have the ability to do this analysis. And so I don't really see any reason why they would just suddenly do it now and not 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, right? I have a feeling that they're in this for the long haul, and that the only thing that will stop this is some sort of change of leadership in Russia via a coup or Putin dying, or somehow Ukraine just outright losing the war. But like my understanding is that it has turned into mostly a stalemate. And the only way I could see Ukraine losing the war at this point is if Western support completely dried up. If all of the European countries suddenly stopped giving them any military support, if the US stopped giving any military support and information and all that stuff, that's really the only way I could see Ukraine just straight up losing. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, right? Even in the event of a serious global financial crisis, which like a Great Depression style thing, which could potentially happen if all the Strait of Hormuz stuff continues through the next 3, 6, 8 months. Even then, I think these countries, and including the U.S., would still find some way to give them enough support to hold out against Russia. And also, even in that scenario, Russia would also be impacted by this global Great Depression or whatever. So it's not like Ukraine would be only affected. Ukraine might be affected slightly more. But I don't really see any way that Ukraine just outright loses this conflict. And I have a hard time imagining that Russia is going to come to some sort of deal with them, even if they get some minor land concessions from it, because that would be effectively seen as a loss, considering how much they've put into it so far, how many people they've lost, how much economic, how many resources they've lost, how much economic gain they've lost, how they've ruined a lot of allyships and previous trade partnerships with European countries and whatnot. So I don't know. I'm not optimistic that this new St. Petersburg Economic Forum or whatever, or, and apparently it's like the 5th one of the war, that this is really going to be any signal that things are going to improve or that ceasefire is in the near future. I'd be surprised.